I can still smell the bleach when I close my eyes. It was 1983, winter in Cleveland. The kind of cold that cracked your fingertips before you finished your shift. I was 22, a janitor at Hargrove Industrial, a steel parts plant that roared like thunder every morning. The floors were always slick with oil, and the air hung thick with iron dust. My job was simple. Keep it clean, stay quiet, don't dream too loud. Mr. Hargrove made sure of that. He was the kind of man who spoke like his words were laws, never sentences. I'll never forget the first time he noticed me. I'd stayed after hours, polishing the breakroom floor, humming to myself. He walked in, suit pressed so tight it could slice paper. "You're still here?" he asked, almost annoyed. "Yes, sir," I said. "Just making sure everything's ready for morning." He smirked, that kind of half-smile that wasn't really a smile. "Don't work too hard, kid. No matter how much you scrub, you'll always be the janitor." He walked away before I could answer. The sound of his shoes echoed across the tile like a hammer in my chest. That night, I sat in the supply closet and stared at the mop in my hand. I didn't see wood and cloth. I saw something else, a beginning. I'd grown up poor on the south side, raised by a mother who ironed clothes for other people, and a father who never came home from Vietnam. We didn't have money, but we had pride. My mother used to say, "Work's work, son, but don't let it define you forever." I took those words and folded them inside me like a secret. Every night, when the factory went quiet, I'd walk through the empty halls, pretending I was the owner. I'd touch the walls, the machines, the old metal railings, and imagine what it would feel like to give orders instead of taking them. One night, I found a discarded stack of shipping reports near the office bins. Numbers, invoices, signatures. I didn't understand much, but I knew it meant something. So I took them home and tried to make sense of them. I didn't even have a calculator, just a pencil and notebook. For the first time, I saw the company like a puzzle, one I could someday solve. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. I learned to work silently, efficiently. The other janitors laughed at me for being so serious. "You act like they'll promote you," one said. I smiled but didn't argue. People who don't see your vision always think you're crazy. A year later, I got my first raise, 10 cents an hour. It wasn't much, but to me it was proof that time was moving. And I was still in the race. Then came that day, the one that burned itself into my memory like acid. It was late Friday evening, Mr. Hargrove, and some of his managers were celebrating a big contract in the office lounge. I was mopping nearby, pretending not to listen. Someone must have told a joke because laughter broke out, loud, heavy, cruel. "Hey, Mike!" Mr. Hargrove shouted. "Come here a second." I froze but walked in. "Yes, sir?" He pointed to my mop and said to the group, "Boys, here's a man with ambition. Says he wants to run a business one day." The room erupted in laughter. I felt my face burn, but I kept quiet. Then he leaned closer, reeking of whiskey, and whispered, "You'll die with that mop in your hand. People like you don't run companies. You clean 'em." Something inside me broke, but not the way he wanted. I didn't snap. I didn't yell. I just looked him in the eye and said softly, "We'll see, sir." He laughed again, harder this time, and turned away. But I meant it. That night, as I walked home through the snow, I swore that one day, no matter how long it took, I'd prove him wrong. I didn't know it then, but that single promise would shape the next 40 years of my life. I started carrying a small spiral notebook in my back pocket after that night, a habit that never left me. Every time I learned something new, overheard something useful, or saw a process worth remembering, I wrote it down. Nobody noticed. To them, I was just another janitor, wiping fingerprints off glass doors. But in my head, I was a student, and that factory was my classroom. During lunch breaks, when others smoked outside, I'd sneak into the accounting office to empty the trash. That's where I met Mr. Daly, an older man with silver hair and a heart too kind for that place. He noticed I always lingered by the file cabinets. "You read numbers?" he asked one day, pulling off his glasses. "Trying to," I admitted. "Just curious about how the company keeps track of things." He chuckled. "Most people run from numbers. You're running toward them." From that day, Mr. Daly became my quiet mentor. During slow afternoons, he'd call me in under the excuse of needing help moving boxes. Then he'd point at invoices and explain what they meant: cost of goods, operating margin, overhead. I listened like a sponge, committing every word to memory. One afternoon, he handed me a thin paperback titled Basic Accounting for Small Business Owners. The pages smelled like dust and ink. "Take it," he said. "Study it. The janitor who understands cash flow will never be a janitor forever." That book became my Bible. I'd sit in the supply closet during night shifts, under the buzz of a single bulb, practicing balance sheets on scrap paper. The echo of machines outside felt like a metronome for my thoughts. While others slept, I worked. Not for overtime, but for knowledge. Of course, not everyone liked that. There was a foreman named Earl, big man with a mustache like a broom. He caught me reading one night. "You think they'll let you be more than a mop man?" he sneered. "Guys like you just make the floor shine, that's it." I smiled faintly. "Maybe, but I like to keep things clean, even the books." He didn't get the joke, but it didn't matter. The factory was a strange world. Loud, ruthless, yet predictable. People clocked in, did their tasks, and complained about pay until Friday. I was part of it, but not of it. I watched and listened. I learned the patterns. When deliveries came, how supervisors reported shortages, which clients always paid late. I knew more about that business than some of its managers did, all without a title, without a desk, without a voice. At home, my wife Linda believed in me more than anyone. She'd wait up with a pot of coffee, even when my shift ended past midnight. I'd tell her what I'd learned and she'd smile through her fatigue. "One day," she'd say, "you'll have your own desk." I can see it, but the truth was, I didn't want just a desk. I wanted his desk, Mr. Hargrove's. Years passed quietly, but my notebook filled faster. Each page was a seed: how machines broke down, how maintenance reports were forged to hide costs, how shipping rates fluctuated with steel prices. I was building an invisible education, one nobody could see, but everyone would someday feel. Then came the year everything nearly collapsed. In 1991, the company lost its biggest client to automation. Layoffs hit hard. I saw grown men cry in the parking lot, boxes of tools in their arms. Somehow I was spared. Janitors are cheap labor, they said. The work doubled, but so did my determination. Every closed door in that factory was a lesson in patience. Every insult from management was a reminder that they were too arrogant to see me coming. One bitter February morning, I found Mr. Daly cleaning out his desk. His department was being outsourced. He looked at me, regret in his eyes. "They don't understand what loyalty means anymore, Mike, but don't lose your hunger." He handed me his worn-out briefcase, brown leather, edges frayed. "Keep it, for when you need to look like more than a janitor." I took it like it was gold. That night, I walked home under falling snow, gripping that briefcase like it contained my future. Because in a way, it did. I wasn't a businessman yet. I wasn't even close. But for the first time in my life, I didn't just dream about being one. I knew I would be, and somewhere in the back of my mind, I could still hear Mr. Hargrove's words. "You'll die with that mop in your hand." Not tonight, I thought. Not ever. The 1990s came like a slow storm, loud enough to shake us, quiet enough that we didn't see the damage until years later. The factory was changing, and not for the better. Machines got older, contracts thinner, and the laughter on the work floor grew tired. I was 30 now. My hair was thinning, my knees ached from years of scrubbing steel dust off concrete. But my mind was sharper than ever. Mr. Hargrove had grown older too, his voice raspier. His walk slower, but his arrogance didn't age a day. He started bringing his son, Greg Hargrove, into the plant. Greg must have been in his 20s, fresh from college, clean shoes, soft hands, expensive cologne. He'd walk past the workers like we were part of the wallpaper. One afternoon I was mopping near the main corridor when he and his father walked by. "Dad," Greg said, nodding toward me, "you still got people doing this by hand. You know automation exists, right?" Mr. Hargrove chuckled. "That one doesn't cost me much." He's been here since before you were born. They both laughed as they walked away. I stared at the floor, the mop water rippling under the flickering light. That laughter, it didn't sting anymore. It carved something deeper. It reminded me of time. They had it, I was earning it. That same year, Linda fell ill. Doctors called it a minor heart condition, but bills don't understand the word minor. The insurance from the company barely covered the tests. I took extra shifts just to pay for medication. Some nights I'd come home past dawn, my hands smelling of bleach and oil. Linda would be awake, pale but smiling with a cup of coffee waiting. "You're working yourself to death," she said one morning, her voice soft. I kissed her hand. "If it means I'll buy you peace one day, it's worth it." She smiled weakly. "Just promise me you'll see it through." "I promise." It was a promise I carried like a heartbeat. At the factory, layoffs came again. The office workers whispered about bankruptcy, mergers, and buyouts. Whole departments vanished overnight. Men who had built that place from scratch were sent home with envelopes and a handshake. But somehow, they never touched the janitors. "You're cheap," the supervisor said, half laughing. "That's your job security. Cheap labor, invisible labor, call it what you want." I called it camouflage, because while they ignored me, I saw everything. The new inventory system that Greg introduced was a mess. Orders went missing, shipments delayed. Suppliers called every day, furious about unpaid invoices. Greg strutted around like a king, giving speeches about modernizing the plant. But all I saw was a spoiled boy running his father's empire into the ground. I started keeping 2 notebooks now, one for learning, one for watching. I wrote down every mistake, every pattern of chaos. By 1995, I knew more about that company's failures than the board did. One night I caught Greg yelling at a mechanic over a broken press machine. The man had tears in his eyes. "It's 40 years old." The mechanic shouted. "It's dying, like the rest of this place." Greg sneered. "Then maybe we should replace you instead." That's when I understood. Some men inherit money, but never the character to deserve it. Mr. Hargrove finally retired in '98, giving the throne to his son. The old man came in once a week to supervise, but mostly to brag about his glory days. When he saw me one last time, he said, "Still mopping floors, huh? Guess I was right after all." I smiled, calm as stone. "Yes, sir. You were right. Back then, he didn't catch the meaning. Under Greg's leadership, things worsened. He replaced experienced foremen with college friends who didn't know a wrench from a socket. Safety corners were cut. Bonuses disappeared. The breakroom coffee went from decent to instant powder. By 2001, people were quitting faster than they could hire replacements. And yet, every Friday, Greg would roll in with a new car, a new watch, a new story about golf trips. The company was bleeding from the inside, and no one cared, except me. I'd mop those same floors and hear the ghost of my mother's voice. "Work's work. But don't let it define you forever." So, I didn't. I started taking night classes at Cuyahoga Community College, 2 days a week, studying accounting and logistics. It was exhausting. I'd clean until 11 p.m., then sit in a classroom until 1 a.m., my uniform still smelling of ammonia. But every lecture felt like fuel. I learned about profit margins, assets, and depreciation. I learned how companies die, from pride, not poverty. One night after class, I walked past the darkened factory and looked through the office window. Greg's light was still on. He was inside, shouting on the phone, pacing, red-faced. I didn't know it then, but that was the night his downfall began. The debts he ignored were already circling him like vultures, and I, the janitor he laughed at, was about to clean more than just his floors. The older I got, the quieter I became. There's a strange peace in being invisible. People speak freely when they think you're just background noise. By the time I reached my 40s, I had mastered that silence. I moved like air through the factory halls, cleaning, watching, listening. Every whispered complaint, every careless confession, every failed plan. I heard it all. The plant was still standing, but barely. Machines rattled like bones. The new office staff came and went faster than the smell of fresh paint. Greg called himself CEO now, though everyone knew the title didn't match the man. He held loud meetings in the conference room, full of talk about efficiency and expansion. Most of us knew it was nonsense. He was trying to sound like his father, but came off like a child imitating authority. I kept to my corner, sweeping the same floors I'd cleaned for decades. But the difference was, I understood every corner of that building now. I knew the rhythm of the factory better than its engineers did. I knew when production slowed, when materials came late, when vendors stopped calling. I had something Greg never had: patience. At night, when the last shift clocked out, I'd stay behind. I'd sit in the janitor's closet with my notebook and briefcase, the one Mr. Daly had given me years ago, and go over what I'd learned. Inside that briefcase were 20 years of notes, numbers, invoices, and sketches of systems that could have saved the company if anyone had cared enough to look. But they didn't. So I started caring in my own way. I enrolled in night classes again, this time in business management. I didn't tell anyone, not even Linda at first. I didn't want to give false hope. It felt too fragile, too personal. But the more I studied, the more I saw the company's future unraveling in my mind like a thread being pulled loose. One night after class, I stopped by a diner near the plant. I sat with a cup of coffee and my old textbooks, highlighting lines about cash flow, investment, and debt leverage. The waitress laughed. "You studying for a promotion?" "Something like that," I said. She didn't know how right she was. By 2005, Greg's leadership had driven the company to the edge. He was firing senior staff to cut costs, selling old equipment for pennies, and taking personal loans in the company's name. The accountants tried to warn him. He replaced them instead. But me, I stayed, always there.
Always cleaning.
Always watching. One afternoon, I overheard a heated phone call from his office while mopping near the hallway. "I told you I'll make the payment next quarter," Greg barked. "Stop calling my personal number." The tone in his voice told me everything I needed to know. The walls were cracking. A few weeks later, I saw a for sale brochure slip out of his briefcase. It wasn't for a house. It was for the company itself. That's when I began preparing. I started setting aside money, real money this time. I'd already been doing small cleaning contracts on the side for local businesses, schools, car dealerships, a hospital wing. Most of them hired me because I was cheap, reliable, and honest. What they didn't know was that I was building something of my own. I registered my side business under a quiet name, Midwest Maintenance and Supply. Nothing fancy, just enough to sound forgettable. By 2007, I had 3 small contracts and 2 part-time employees, both old factory friends who had been laid off. I paid them fairly, made sure they got health coverage, and kept my word on every paycheck. It wasn't much, but it was mine. At home, Linda had grown weaker, but she still smiled when I told her about the business. "You're doing it, Mike," she whispered one night from the couch. "You're building something honest." I held her hand, rough against soft. "I'm building something for us." A year later, I buried her. The house felt like a hollow drum after that. The only thing that kept me moving was that promise, the one I made to her and to myself. So I worked harder. My side business grew quietly while the factory shrank loudly. I saved every dollar. I watched every mistake Greg made, like a chess player waiting for his opponent to run out of moves. And slowly, over the years, that invisible janitor became something no one saw coming, a man with a plan. By the time 2010 rolled around, our Grove Industrial was a shadow of what it once was. The plant that had once echoed with the thunder of steel presses now wheezed like an old machine gasping for air. Half the floor lights were dark to save electricity. The vending machines stood empty. The break room smelled of rust and instant coffee. Greg Hargrove had officially taken over as full owner after his father passed. But instead of building something from his inheritance, he turned it into a monument to his ego. He wore $1,000 suits to a factory where workers couldn't afford lunch. He drove a new Mercedes into a parking lot full of dented pickups and laid off men's cars that hadn't moved in weeks. He didn't lead. He performed. Every Monday, he'd hold what he called leadership updates. We all knew they were just opportunities for him to hear himself talk. I'd be in the corner with my mop, quiet, invisible, listening. He'd say things like, "We're restructuring for the modern age," or "We're optimizing production flow." But I knew the truth. He was drowning in debt. I'd seen the red-stamped invoices, the supplier warnings, the collection letters tossed in bins I emptied every night. One evening, while emptying his trash, I found a crumpled letter from the bank. The words were clear: final notice, loan default imminent. I didn't touch it. I just stared at it for a moment, realizing the balance of power had quietly begun to shift. The man who once mocked me for cleaning floors was now buried under a mess no mop could fix. And still, he didn't stop bragging. He'd walk around the plant like a politician on campaign day, patting backs, pretending everything was fine. "We're expanding to new markets," he'd say, while vendors refused to ship him raw materials. He hosted a Christmas party that year at a hotel downtown, rented tux, open bar, the works, while half the staff hadn't seen a raise in 5 years. That night, after the party ended, I walked through the empty plant, the same halls where I once swore revenge. I ran my hand across the cold railing and whispered to myself, almost there, because by then I was no longer just a janitor. My company, Midwest Maintenance and Supply, had grown into a reliable regional service. We handled contracts for 5 warehouses, 2 schools, and even a government facility. I had savings, steady income, and connections. The kind of quiet power men like Greg never notice until it's too late. The irony. I was still cleaning his factory. He never questioned why I stayed. I think in his mind, I had already accepted my place. That arrogance blinded him from seeing that I was studying his downfall in real time. The final crack came in 2012. Greg had taken out a massive loan to fund an expansion project. A second plant that was supposed to revive Hargrove Industrial. The problem? He didn't have the contracts to support it. Within months, the expansion was bleeding cash. Clients walked away. Investors panicked. Workers were laid off in waves. The once busy parking lot turned into a graveyard of rusting machines and silence. One morning, I arrived early and saw Greg standing in the middle of the floor, alone. He looked smaller somehow, shoulders slumped, hair thinning at the edges. For the first time in 30 years, I almost pitied him. Almost. He looked at me and said, "You've been here a long time, haven't you?" "Yes, sir," I replied. He gave a dry laugh. "Then you've seen it all fall apart. Maybe you should have warned me." I looked him in the eye. "You wouldn't have listened." He smiled bitterly. "You're probably right." It was the closest thing to honesty I'd ever heard from him. 2 months later, the company was officially listed for sale. Greg was desperate, drowning in taxes, lawsuits, unpaid vendors. Nobody wanted to touch the place. It had become toxic in the local business community. Nobody except me. While Greg scrambled to find buyers, I was already working behind the scenes. I'd contacted an old friend, Mr. Daly's nephew, a financial consultant who believed in quiet revenge as much as I did. Together, we built a plan. My cleaning company would make a bid through a newly formed holding firm. Greg wouldn't even know who the buyer was. The offer was modest, almost insulting, but in his desperation, he accepted the meeting. And as I stood in front of the mirror that morning, buttoning the same kind of crisp shirt Greg used to mock me for never owning, I realized something. I had spent decades cleaning his floors. Now I was about to clean up his legacy. I learned quickly that the quietest moves are the deadliest. Real revenge doesn't shout from rooftops. It arranges itself in small, relentless steps that the other man never sees until the whole thing is done. First, I stopped talking about plans. Words are cheap and they travel fast. I started moving money the same way I'd always moved through the plant, silently, with purpose. Every contract Midwest Maintenance and Supply won, a portion of the profit went into a separate account. No one knew about it. Not the crew, not my accountant, not even the bank teller who smiled like he knew my life story. Then I reached out to an old man I trusted more than most living people, Mr. Daly's nephew. Ethan, Daly had been the one who taught me to love numbers, who gave me the briefcase and the courage to study. When Daly died, he'd left a note asking Ethan to help the janitor who cleaned better than most managers. Ethan ran a small financial consulting practice across town. He believed in quiet integrity, and he owed my mentor a debt. We didn't meet in fancy places, mostly a booth at an afternoon diner, sunlight across the table, coffee gone cold by the time we were done. I told him the truth, what the company had been, how it had fallen apart, and how I thought it could be fixed. I didn't speak of hatred so much as responsibility. I can run it right, I told him. I can make it honest again. But I can't do it alone. Ethan listened, folded his hands and said, "You've been planning this since you were 22, haven't you?" "I suppose I have," he smiled thinly. "All right. We'll do it your way, quiet, steady. We'll form a holding company, structure the bid so it doesn't scream janitor across the room. People buy companies all the time if the numbers make sense. We'll find a way to make the numbers make sense." So we did. We made Midwest Maintenance and Supply the heart of a modest holding firm, Hearthstone Investments, registered in a small office that smelled of fresh paint and possibility. I signed the papers with hands that had scrubbed 1,000 floors and felt proud in a way that was almost sacred. This was the moment the mop and the briefcase finally met on even ground. We started buying small blocks of stock from employees who needed cash fast, men who'd been laid off, folks retiring early, people who trusted the paycheck more than the future. They paid fair, sometimes above market, because time was worth a premium. They sold to me without questions. Money solves most mysteries. Each tiny purchase felt like slipping another link into a chain. Nobody noticed the chain until it was already around their neck. Meanwhile, I smoothed the edges of Midwest Maintenance so it looked like a competent, respectable company. I audited our books, tightened contracts, hired a bookkeeper who actually understood accruals and depreciation. I made sure our union contacts were solid, that our payrolls were clean, that the small things were impeccable. If I was going to buy a factory, I wasn't going to show up with sloppy paperwork. All the while, I kept cleaning Hargrove's floors. The irony amused me. I'd mop past the conference room where Greg held his panicked calls and feel no rush of triumph yet, only a slow, satisfying calm. The work of 40 years had finally produced leverage. Patience had turned into capital. We filed our bid the day the bank auctions were announced. I didn't go to the public meeting. Ethan did the talking, a polite man in a well-cut suit who described our vision for the plant: community jobs, reinvestment, honest governance. Our offer wasn't the flashiest, but it was the most credible. Creditors liked credibility more than drama. I remember sitting in my truck in the lot that afternoon, the engine ticking as it cooled, staring at the entrance where men came and went. I felt no hunger for spectacle anymore. Revenge had never been about making him suffer publicly. It was about restoring balance and giving dignity back to people who'd been forgotten. When the call came saying the board had accepted our proposal, I felt oddly small and enormous at the same time. Ethan clapped my shoulder like a partner. "You did it," he said simply. "No," I replied. "We did it." In the weeks that followed, paperwork became the new battlefield. Letters, signatures, trust agreements. Greg thought he could outmaneuver creditors with lawyers and fast deals. He couldn't. He had mismanaged the company until the only offers left were from those who understood repair, not pilfering. And so the moment arrived, not with thunder, but with a quiet knock on the door of the meeting room, where Greg waited with a face full of fragile rage. I walked in, briefcase at my side, tie a little loose from the weight of the day. He looked up and squinted at me as if trying to place a ghost. "You brought the janitor to the table?" he asked. I sat down, placed my hands on the table, and felt the grain of wood that had once felt like a bar to climb. "I brought someone who remembers what honest work looks like," I said. He barked a laugh that had nothing behind it. "You could have knocked." "I did," I said. 40 years ago. The day of the deal came on a Thursday morning. The sky hung grey over Cleveland, the kind of sky that always made the river look like dull metal. I arrived at the bank wearing The same leather shoes I'd polished for Linda's funeral years earlier, the only pair I'd ever called formal. My hands shook slightly as I carried that old briefcase, the one Mr. Daly had given me. 40 years of grit and grief were tucked inside it. Ethan was already there, sitting across from the loan officers and attorneys. The room smelled of stale coffee and paperwork, just the kind of place where power changes hands without noise. Greg Hargrove stood near the window, his back to us, tapping his fingers against the glass. He looked thinner, older. The shine was gone from his hair. When he turned around, his face twitched with a mix of arrogance and desperation. "So," he said, forcing a grin, "you're the mysterious buyer. Hearthstone Investments, right? Never heard of you." Ethan smiled politely. "That's because we don't advertise. We just repair what's broken." Greg laughed hollowly. "Good luck with that." I didn't speak. Not yet. He slid the documents across the table, rattling off terms, percentages, clauses. I'd spent the last month studying every line. Ethan asked careful questions. Greg gave impatient answers. His confidence cracked more each time he realized how little leverage he had. Finally, the banker cleared his throat. "Mr. Hargrove, if you're ready to proceed, please sign here. Hearthstone's transfer will finalize upon your signature." Greg clicked his pen, muttering under his breath. "Can't believe it's come to this. My father built this company from nothing." That was the moment I looked up. "No," I said quietly. "Your father built it on the backs of men who worked until their hands bled, the ones who weren't allowed to sit at this table." He frowned, squinting at me as though hearing a familiar voice through fog. "Do I know you?" I leaned forward, sliding the briefcase onto the table. "You used to call me the mop man." His jaw slackened. He blinked once, twice. "You?" "Yes, Greg," I said softly. "Me." The silence that followed was so heavy the ticking clock sounded like a drum. The banker shifted uncomfortably. Ethan didn't say a word. Greg's face turned red. "You're telling me you're buying my company," I corrected him gently. "It was never yours. You just borrowed it from men who cared more than you did." He looked around the room, as if expecting someone to step in, to stop the humiliation unfolding in front of him. No one did. His pen trembled as he signed the papers. When the banker took them back, stamping them with a dull thud, it was official. The company I had cleaned for 40 years was now mine. I rose from my chair and reached out my hand. "You're free to take your things from the office by tomorrow. After that, security will escort you out." Greg stared at my hand, then at me, and for a second I thought he might actually shake it. Instead, he pushed back from the table. "You think this makes you better than me? You're still a janitor." I smiled. "Maybe, but now I own the floors I clean." He stormed out, slamming the door so hard the blinds rattled. The banker exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for years. Ethan grinned. "You handled that better than I would have." I looked at the contract one last time. The ink was still wet, the company's seal still warm from the stamp. For all its years of noise and metal, that factory had just changed hands in absolute silence. We drove straight to the plant afterward. I stepped out of the car and looked at the building that had defined my life. Brick walls stained with time, windows fogged with dust, the smell of iron and memory in the air. The employees gathered when they saw me. Old faces, new faces, tired faces. I walked up the narrow stairs to the same office where I'd once mopped spilled whiskey off the floor after Mr. Hargrove's parties. Now it was mine. I stood at the doorway, taking in the view. The factory floor below was quiet. In that stillness, I heard everything I'd ever worked for, every insult, every sleepless night, every whispered prayer. Then I whispered back, "We made it, Linda." And for the first time in 40 years, the janitor didn't need to ask for permission to go upstairs. The next morning, I walked into the factory, not as the janitor, but as the owner. The winter. Air bit at my cheeks as I crossed the same parking lot I'd once swept clean of cigarette butts. The same cracked pavement, the same rusting gate. But this time, when I reached for the door, it opened for me. Inside, the hum of machines was faint, uncertain. The workers looked up from their stations, puzzled. Word travels fast in places like that, faster than sound itself. By the time I reached the main floor, whispers had already turned into murmurs. That's him, the janitor. He bought the place. I climbed the narrow iron steps to the catwalk above the assembly line, a spot I'd avoided for decades. From up there, I could see every man, every woman, every tool and corner that had shaped my life. My chest tightened. I cleared my throat. "Can I have everyone's attention, please?" The room quieted, except for the buzz of the fluorescent lights. For a second, I saw their faces, worn, skeptical, tired, the faces of people who'd been let down too many times. "I know you've all heard rumors," I said, "and I want to tell you they're true. As of yesterday, Hargrove Industrial is under new ownership." Someone near the back whispered, "Who bought it?" I smiled faintly. I did. The silence that followed was thicker than the air itself. Then came the disbelief, small laughs, raised eyebrows, a few stunned glances. One of the machinists, old Frank, wiped his hands on a rag and said, "Mike, you mean you?" "Yes, Frank, me." The laughter that followed wasn't mocking. It was relief, like someone had finally opened a window in a room that had been shut too long. "I started here 40 years ago," I said, my voice trembling just a little. "I cleaned these floors. I emptied your trash. I fixed leaks when nobody else would. I've seen this company fall apart because the people who ran it forgot what built it in the first place. You." Heads nodded, quiet agreement spreading through the crowd. "I don't want applause. I don't want revenge. I want to rebuild this place the way it should have been. Fair pay, honest leadership, no more lies, no more cuts from the top while the bottom bleeds dry." There were murmurs of approval now, small, cautious claps. Then I added, "But before we rebuild, we need to clean house." I turned as footsteps echoed on the stairs behind me. Greg Hargrove was climbing up, his face pale, eyes bloodshot. He looked at the crowd, then at me, disbelief painted all over him. "What the hell is this?" he barked. "You can't just—" I raised my hand. "Greg, it's over. Your father's company is gone. This place is under my ownership now. You're no longer employed here," he froze.
"You can't fire me."
"I'm a Hargrove." "You're an employee," I said calmly, "and a terrible one. I'm giving you the same respect you gave others. None. You have 10 minutes to clear your desk." He stepped closer, face red, voice cracking. "You think this makes you better than me? You'll run this place into the ground." I looked around at the workers, men and women who had sweated for decades while he collected bonuses. "No, Greg, you already did that. We're here to build it back." He stared at me for a long second, breathing hard. Then, realizing there was no one left to defend him, he turned and stormed down the stairs. The workers didn't jeer. They didn't clap. They just watched in silence, the kind that marks the end of something rotten. When he was gone, I took a deep breath and said, "Let's get back to work." The floor filled with life again, cautious smiles, shoulders relaxing, machines starting up. As I walked through the aisles, I felt hands clap my back, voices calling, "Good for you, Mike. About damn time. We're with you." That night, I stayed late in the same office Greg had ruled from. His family photos were still on the shelf. I boxed them up carefully and left them by the door. On the desk, I placed something else, my old mop, the same one from 40 years ago. It leaned there, clean and quiet, like a reminder, because revenge wasn't about shouting. It wasn't about anger or humiliation. It was about justice finding its way home, even if it took a lifetime to get there. When I finally switched off the lights, the factory floor glowed faintly below me. No longer a place of shame, but of pride, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I didn't just clean the dirt. I'd washed away a legacy of arrogance. In the months that followed, the factory began to sound alive again. The clang of machines returned, steady, confident, almost like a heartbeat. It wasn't easy. God knows it wasn't. The place had been hollowed out by years of neglect, and trust doesn't grow overnight. The first thing I did was bring back the people who'd kept this place running long before Greg ever learned how to sign his name. Old mechanics, welders, foremen who knew every bolt in those machines by heart. I called them all personally. Some couldn't believe it was real. "Mike, you mean you're calling me back?" One said over the phone. "Yes, Charlie," I told him. "And this time, you'll be treated like the reason we survive." The first week back, they came in early, coffee in hand, no fancy speeches, no cameras. Just good old-fashioned work. They cleaned, repaired, rebuilt. The air filled with the smell of oil and iron again, not despair. I replaced the office carpets with plain tile, easier to clean, less to hide. I tore down the fake motivational posters and hung up framed photographs of every worker from the company's first 20 years. We called it the Wall of Builders. Every face mattered again. For the first time in a long while, people smiled when they walked through those gates. But it wasn't just about sentiment. I knew business had to change if we were going to survive. So I used what I'd learned in those long nights at the janitor's closet. Efficiency, inventory control, fair procurement. I cut unnecessary contracts, paid debts quietly, and reached out to old clients who'd left during the chaos. "Mike," one of them said, "you're really running it now?" "Yes," I replied. "The janitor's in charge." There'd be a pause, then a laugh. "Then maybe it'll finally get cleaned up." Within a year, we were solvent again. No fancy investors, no miracle. Just steady hands and honest numbers. We started small, taking orders we could actually fulfill, delivering on time and keeping promises. That alone was enough to rebuild our reputation. On Fridays, I'd still walk the floors like I used to, except now people stopped to talk. They didn't lower their voices when I passed. They told me what was working, what wasn't, and I listened, truly listened. That was something the Hargroves never did. I also kept the old mop, the same one from my first day. I placed it in the lobby, mounted inside a glass case with a small brass plaque beneath it that read, "Every empire starts with work someone thought was beneath them." Visitors stopped to read it. Some smiled. Some didn't get it, but the workers did. And sometimes, when the nights grew long, I'd find myself standing in front of it, remembering the boy who had once believed he'd die with that mop in his hand. The irony wasn't lost on me. I still held it in a way. Just differently now. By the second year, the company was thriving again. We introduced training programs for younger workers, partnered with local trade schools, offered healthcare benefits, and paid fair overtime. People stopped calling it Hargrove Industrial. The new sign above the gate read, "Midwest Steel and Maintenance, founded on hard work." I never changed the old Hargrove logo completely, though. I left a small H carved into the corner of the company's seal. Not as respect, but as a scar. A reminder of what happens when pride blinds you to people's worth. Sometimes, when I'd walk through the office late at night, I'd imagine Linda sitting in the chair across from my desk, smiling that soft, patient smile of hers. "You did it," I'd whisper into the quiet. I visited her grave every Sunday, bringing her favorite lilies. I'd sit on the grass, coat buttoned up against the wind, and tell her about the company, the workers, the new apprentices learning the ropes. And even though she was gone, I swear I could almost hear her say, "See it through. Mike, you did." The revenge I once dreamed of had long since turned into something else. It wasn't about proving Mr. Hargrove wrong anymore. It was about proving that decency lasts longer than cruelty, and that maybe, in the end, the best revenge wasn't firing his son. It was making the place better than either of them ever could. Sometimes I still come in early, before the lights are on, and before the first worker clocks in. The factory sits quiet then, bathed in the pale blue of dawn. It hums with memory, ghosts of laughter, of arguments, of footsteps long gone. I walk those aisles slowly, the way you walk through a church. The walls don't feel heavy anymore, they feel earned. I pause by the display in the lobby, the old mop sealed behind glass, standing proud like an artifact from another life. Beneath it, The brass plaque still gleams. Every empire starts with work someone thought was beneath them. That sentence has carried me further than any paycheck ever could. Sometimes visitors ask me why I kept it. Why not throw away the symbol of what I used to be? I tell them because it reminds me that dignity never had anything to do with the size of your office. It's about how you carry yourself when no one's watching. I started here as a janitor, and I'm not ashamed of that. It made me patient. It made me observant. It made me the man who could build something worth owning. And I'll tell you something else. Revenge changes shape over the years. When I was young, I wanted to hurt the people who laughed at me. I wanted to stand in front of them and make them feel small. But 40 years teaches you something, that revenge without wisdom just turns you into what you hate. The real revenge is to outlast them, to build something they said you never could, to prove that respect earned honestly will always outlive arrogance bought cheaply. When I fired Greg, I thought that moment would taste sweeter. But standing there watching him leave with his box of things, I didn't feel triumph. I felt closure. It was like setting down a weight I'd been carrying since I was 22. You can spend your life chasing payback, but peace only comes when you forgive yourself for ever believing their words. These days, I spend more time mentoring than managing. I tell the younger workers, don't just do your job, understand it. Every screw, every shipment, every mistake. Someday, the boss who ignores you might be gone, and you'll be the one who knows how to rebuild it. They usually smile, half understanding. That's all right. I was their age once, too. On Fridays before I leave, I like to stand by the factory door and watch the workers heading home. Laughter trails through the air again. Nobody rushes out in anger anymore. They shake hands. They talk about dinner plans, about their kids' games. It feels like a family again, and every time I whisper a quiet thank you to Linda, to Mr. Daly, even to Mr. Hargrove, because without them, without all the humiliation, the nights alone, the endless mopping, the silence, I wouldn't have become the man I am. Before I lock up, I always walk into my office one last time. I keep the same wooden chair Mr. Hargrove once sat in, though it creaks now. Behind the desk hangs a framed photo of the factory from 1983, back when I was just a kid in overalls, holding a mop. I look at that photo every night before turning off the lights. That boy had no idea what waited ahead. He just knew one thing. He wouldn't quit, and if you're listening to this story right now, maybe from your kitchen table, or your porch, or your own night shift, I want you to remember something. Nobody decides your worth but you. Not your boss, not your paycheck, not the voices that try to keep you small, because sometimes the person everyone underestimates is the one who ends up owning the room. Before we end tonight, if my story means something to you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from. I like to think of all of us, scattered across different towns, different jobs, different struggles, finding the same lesson in the same quiet truth. Life may hand you a mop, but what you build with it, that's up to you.